All right, good afternoon. Watching some folks roll in, but thanks for joining us. I'm Jenna Talbot, a Senior Vice President at Whiteboard Advisors. I have the pleasure of working alongside the Strata Center for Consumer Insights. And today we're going to be introducing Public Viewpoints, which is a new weekly survey looking at the impact of COVID on Americans' work and education. For 4 years now, Strata has been tracking the perspectives of consumers as it relates to their education experiences and the role that education has played in their employment. And likewise, this survey is really designed to surface the perspectives of consumers to help inform our understanding of this rapidly changing world and eventually provide some insights into the road to recovery. Of course, this is a moment of unprecedented uncertainty, and we're all grappling with what the implications might be for the pandemic. So today you'll hear a little bit about the initial findings from the survey, the questions that are going to be tracked weekly, and really this is an opportunity to invite some further feedback and engagement from you all. Before we jump in, just a few housekeeping notes here. It's been a little bit of a rough day for Zoom, so thanks for making the transition over to the new link. We're really looking forward to the conversation. We welcome questions. You'll see at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A box, so please add any questions you may have as we go. We'll make sure to have plenty of time to discuss those as we get into the conversation. And the research team is also really interested in your feedback on additional questions or issues you'd like to see them address in the research. So if you want to go ahead and add those into the chat box, that'll allow us to be able to revisit some of those topics. So welcome all perspectives and questions as we go. With that, I'll turn it over to Dave Clayton. Dave is the Senior Vice President of Strata's Center for Consumer Insights. So Dave, take it away.
Thank you, Jenna, and thank you to the team. You all know that we have teams that make it possible to pull this off and to be in a position to share with you. Particularly appreciation to Nicole and Andrew, my colleagues, and their work, and we'll be hearing from them today with these insights. You know, this team really started, as Jenna said, in 2016 as Strata made that commitment to surveying Americans, past, present, and potentially future students about their needs from education, particularly as it connected to work and their aspirations for financial and economic security and stability. And so this moment we're in is really dynamic and changing and unprecedented, as Jenna spoke to us. And we've launched a new initiative, and we'll tell you a little bit about that briefly, but move into what we're learning even in over the first 2 or 3 weeks of understanding how Americans are experiencing the COVID-19 impact. The numbers today are 14,000 Americans who've lost their lives. I have a family friend who's one of those. You all know people who have been diagnosed or hospitalized, and those numbers will continue to grow. So I think first and foremost, the American public is committed to a public health response. 51% of Americans say that's the immediate priority, and 38% say, well, we need to balance public health with economic impacts and what we're reflecting. So we acknowledge and appreciate those on the front lines, those who are dealing directly with the health impacts, and many who don't have the opportunities to work remotely like I do. They go to work and can't isolate, and they're at risk in their day-to-day work that keeps groceries coming and to all of us around the nation. So our thanks to them and our thanks to you as we share today. And we really want to do it in that tone. We've initiated this effort, a Public Viewpoint, to quickly and effectively get information out to leaders in business, in government, in education, in communities, with understanding of how Americans are experiencing this so that we can work with them, support them, and ultimately work together as we look to recovery and rebuilding lives and rebuilding our communities and our economy as we go through this. This is a commitment to weekly monitoring. We'll do that over time. As things plateau, we'll move to bi-weekly or monthly monitoring, but we'll continue to track these experiences. It'll guide all of us into places where we may need to look more in depth or ask better questions or look at moments in time. And so we want to share with you, and as Jenna expressed, we want this to be the start of a dialogue and a discussion amongst the field. So help us understand what things you need to know in the coming weeks and months so that we can weave those into the fabric of our analyses and our questions and what we're looking for. Thank you for indulging me with a little preamble, but we all are in this together, and we want to be a part of the solutions that you look for in your respective responsibilities and areas of influence. Quick highlights from this week. We're going to go into these in a little bit of detail, and some of you may have downloaded materials and had a preview already, but it's spreading. 83% of Americans view it as a real threat. At this point, the majority of Americans are feeling the direct impact emotionally and in their pocketbooks. The health impacts have not hit as many people as the financial and the anxiety impact have. The feelings of job security it's almost exponential in the deterioration as we look at that over the last week even, and Nicole will be speaking to that in a minute. Interestingly and uniquely, this is one place in our work with consumers where we're not seeing differences by people's level of education or their prior education. It's affecting all people from all walks of life evenly. It's early. People are coping. Many are in shock, disoriented. We don't know how people ultimately settle about the need for education as they reskill and upskill. We have some early signs. We'll continue to monitor those, but we'll share those today. And we'll just move in a little bit to that. And again, note your questions as we go through, share those for us to capture as well as for us to engage in the discussion at the conclusion of this brief presentation this morning. I think Jenna may have mentioned we may not use a full hour today, but we wanted to orient and introduce you to these findings. Key questions we're focused on this week in 3 buckets, really. Well-being, emotionally, the subjective sense of how people are doing, the impact on work that's taken place already, because that's where the majority of the anxiety and emotional pressure is for Americans right now, is around work. And then hypothetically, or looking forward or in anticipation, what would the role of education be for individuals as they lose work or need to change careers, and how they're feeling about that and what they're looking to in the future. I just highlight this chart shows the percentage of people who say, this is what I'm feeling. This is a broader battery of about a dozen emotions, but these really typify the sentiment where kind of people are concerned. Over 60% recognize something's going on. What was interesting this week is you'll notice the line for worry in green and angry and scared down below are all ticking up. And that's kind of that is a very normal phenomenon as people move through the shock and the reality and start to hear the impact, and will start to feel the frustration and realize what could have been done or what isn't working and what the pressure on their lives is. We expect that'll continue to grow in coming weeks. When you asked individuals across America what they think will be the effect of the coronavirus outbreak on their lives, you see that finance is at the top. 54% of Americans expect a very negative or somewhat negative impact on their finances, and similarly on their jobs, with mental health and kind of the pressure they're feeling, and all of us are feeling in different ways, and even physical health trailing behind that concern about finances and jobs being the most widespread issues for Americans. I'll turn the time over to Nicole, who's going to talk a little bit about the immediate work impact that people are experiencing already. Nicole?
Okay, thanks, Dave. Can you hear me all right? Yeah, okay. So as Dave mentioned, we've seen that a lot of people's top concerns right now are around their jobs and their finances. And this is something that we've seen a really big increase in just in the past week. So when we asked this question a week ago about how many Americans had either lost their jobs or had their hours or income reduced, last week it was about 46%, and you can see this week it's already jumped to 61% just in a week. So that's a really huge impact. And we've all heard the unemployment numbers, and we know that the impact goes even beyond those who have completely lost their jobs, that a number of people are being affected in terms of, losing hours and losing income. And so we wanted to also look beyond the people who have lost their jobs and see, what about people who are still employed? How worried are they
Nicole,
about?
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
your internet is fairly garbled and maybe distracting. I might step in.
Yep.
As Nicole was saying, that there's been that immediate, people have already lost income. And as we looked at, well, what about those of you who remain employed? These are people who are not unemployed looking for work, but they're currently full-time, part-time, or self-employed. And you just see that tremendous growth in the course of 1 week, who are worried about their job security. And most of that growth coming at, if you look to the bottom right-hand corner, that lighter blue, a 10% increase in those who are extremely worried about losing their jobs. So this anxiety and concern about job security is rapidly changing and is affecting Americans. Nicole, do you want to try this next slide and see if the internet's any quicker?
Yeah, it may not be different. Let me know. How's it going? It's fine? Okay. So here, as Dave was mentioning before, this is really different in that we're seeing this impact across people from all levels of education. So a lot of times in our previous research, we've seen pretty big distinctions in the experiences of people depending if they have a college degree or not. And here we see that people with associate degrees, bachelor's degrees and higher are being hit just as hard in terms of losing job and income and hours, or being worried about losing their job. So we're not seeing at the moment that having a degree is any kind of insulation from the impact of this when it comes to work and income for people. So the next part of this presentation, Andrew, my colleague, is going to dig in a little bit more on this question of education and how people are feeling about whether or not education will be a solution as part of the recovery. People who are losing their jobs, are they going to look to upskill and reskill? Do they know where to go? And what are they going to go back to the same jobs? Or are they looking to change career fields if they do lose their job due to the current crisis?
Thank you, Nicole. And that was a great teeing up of this point. Before I get into what we're showing on this slide, I want to just cue up the notion that the first thing that we found is that alongside all of the unprecedented changes that have taken place at a rapid pace, Americans are continuing to be steadfast in their belief that getting more education is essential to having a good job. So 2 out of 3 Americans agreed with the view that in times of economic uncertainty, getting more education is essential to having a good job. So what you're seeing on this slide is we asked Americans, if they lost their job today, would you pursue additional education and training to get a job that pays the same? And 1 out of 3 said that they would. So there is continued interest and appetite for post-secondary education and training among a significant share of the population. 66% of this population that believe that they would need more education and training say that they're confident that they would know where to go to get that education and training. Though we also found that those with less education were far less confident in their ability to find that education and training than those who already have a college degree. We also investigated, as Nicole alluded to, why this population would seek more education and training to reskill and transition to a different career, or to upskill and advance in the career in the field that they're working in today. And 2/3, or 64%, said that they were doing it to reskill and to transition into a different field. We don't yet know where they're looking to transition into, but that's something that we hope to investigate in the coming weeks as we survey more Americans.
Nicole, do you want to comment on Andrew's point of looking at industries and fields and how we see this evolving as we track data in the weeks going forward? Sorry, Nicole's internet maybe is frozen, but as we're tracking, we are asking people about the industries in which they work and where they are seeking work. And we'll be able to aggregate those and build this database over time so we can come back to you with insights into how these sentiments are changing and the expectations across different occupational fields and industries. Sorry, Andrew, go ahead.
And so finally, with respect to education, we asked this population where they would go to pursue this education and training. And this is one of our more surprising findings so far. The majority, or 54%, as you can see here, said that they would go to some kind of online provider, whether that's a four-year college or university, a community college, or an alternative provider of online education. And perhaps even more interesting, another way to look at this is that only 25% of this population said that they would go to what many of us think of as traditional providers that provide in-person education. So 75% said they'd either go to an online option or pursue a formal training program through an employer. And so just to reiterate, again, it's very early, and we don't know whether these trends will hold in the coming weeks and months, but these data suggest that new preferences may be radically emerging. Dave?
Thanks, Andrew. And again, as things settle, one thing we do have the benefit of is looking at, a year ago, what were people expecting as their preferred paths and providers for education, and where are they now? And so we'll be coming back to you as some of these trends and movement feel a little more stable and can do some comparing and contrasting with pre and post on some of these dimensions. And we look forward to doing that. I think just in summary from this week, the worries and fears are intensifying. The impact and the disruption around jobs and work and job security are accelerating quickly. There has not been insulation against that impact and against that worry by educational experiences. And there still remains a general commitment and belief that education is valuable in having secure employment. 2/3 of Americans come down on that side saying it's worth it, it's important during uncertain times to get new skills, to get additional education. At this moment, Americans are really divided. 1/3 say, if I lost my job, I would definitely need additional education training to replace it. 1/3 say, I have no idea. And 1/3 say, I would not need education, and there's a path forward otherwise to replace my work and secure something new. So we hope that provides a good overview. And as you started to share questions and thoughts with Jenna, who will moderate and help us through a little bit of discussion as a group here. And again, thank you to our team, and thank you to each of you for participating and for the work you're doing on the front lines. Jenna, I'll turn to you.
Yes. Well, great. We'll get through. There's lots of questions popping up. One housekeeping item that I see as a common question is you can find the findings available online at strataeducation.org/public viewpoint. And we will also upload the webinar likely tomorrow, but you can find the deck with additional context there. One question let's start out with. Dave, can you talk, or any of the three of you, can you talk to the survey methodology and sample size, getting some questions around who are the folks that you're surveying so far?
Thank you. maybe in my emotion about starting this, I didn't slow down enough with the cognitive and rational points. Heart and Mind Strategies is a national market research firm. They're conducting a weekly omnibus survey of 1,000 or more adults that are representative of adults ages 18 plus on the census in terms of race, ethnicity, age, geography, and the standard dimensions that you would expect. So it is a nationally representative sample that we're reporting on adults ages 18 and above. You'll find on the website the verbatim questions, the margin of error, the frequency of people who said gave each response that was available to them. So our goal is really to make that fully transparent and documented so that you can feel confident using this, sharing it, putting it to work. So please email us. There's an email there if there's additional questions about that can be helpful. Thank you, Jenna.
And what are you seeing? I know that your team is digging through all of the different implications of this research, but we're getting a number of questions around breakdowns by race and by ethnicity.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that a little bit?
Nicole, do you want to, you've been the deepest into the data files. Do you want to speak a little bit to that?
Right. I think that's absolutely something that we're going to be looking to explore in the coming weeks. We have a number of different demographic variables that we can look at, including the industries people are working in, race, ethnicity, age, just to see, because we know in times of crisis like this that it affects different people in different ways. And so thank you for raising that. And that's absolutely something that we'll want to be digging into in the future.
Another question we have, perhaps maybe a little bit of speculation for you all, but I know it looks like folks are really caught by the 61% of Americans who have lost hours and jobs. And the question is, why aren't the worry numbers higher? And I'd be curious, maybe you can speak to the change that we have seen week to week so far. And that'll, I suspect, will be something to watch over time.
We're very curious about that. Last week, we have a number we didn't report. 7% of Americans said they had already lost their jobs. And I was scouring websites and pinging Andrew and Nicole in the middle of the night and saying, could this be right? This would mean that 10 million Americans say they've lost their jobs. And the next morning, the unemployment benefit filings were coming through. So the scale is astonishing, and we're really trying to monitor and make sure how these subjective reports are tracking with the behaviors we can observe. What's interesting about why the worry is not higher is curious, and will be interesting to see how that settles into people. One of the dimensions we didn't feature was hopefulness, and there's been over the last 2 weeks an increase in people who say they feel hopeful in response to the coronavirus and the epidemic. And we asked a secondary probe about where that hopefulness comes from, and people spoke to their optimism, to their belief in the American spirit, to their faith as reasons in their response to feeling hopeful. I just don't know how real this has been. We find also that those with the most education and the most news consumption have the greatest levels of worry. And so there may be something about visibility and awareness of how this can unfold and the systemic impacts that we're not entirely clear on yet, but we are monitoring. Nicole, is there anything you'd add to, we've had this discussion a little bit.
In terms of the worry and the percentage of that, yeah, I mean, we do see that people with higher levels of education do have higher levels of worry, and it'll be interesting to see how this changes, and part of it is going to be a reflection of who still has a job or not, because we're asking people who have jobs, how worried are you? And as more people have lost their jobs, then maybe that's going to sort out differently in terms of people's expectations about what's to come and how secure they are.
I know that's happening on the physical health side of it. As we know people who are impacted, it changes our perception, and I expect the economic things will happen also as it gets closer. Jenna, other?
Yes. Thank you all for your questions. Trying to get through as many of these as possible. Another question is, will you be able to ask respondents who recognize the need for the need to return to school, whether they'd be interested in non-degree credentials, shorter form programs?
Nicole, do you want to comment on that and perhaps comment on our larger national survey that's in the field right now that'll come out midsummer?
Absolutely. That's something that we are very interested in. And so we've been tracking this in a number of ways. We have this survey that's weekly tracking, and we're asking people about the types of education that they would be looking for. And so there's the question we displayed today, as well as another question about where people are likely to seek education. There's high interest in things like employer provided education. And then, as Dave alluded to, at the same time, we have another national survey in the field right now in partnership with Gallup that is kind of a continuation of our previous 4 years worth of work. And we're digging into a deeper understanding of some of these non-degree credentials and where people are obtaining them, and the fields, and then the value that people are finding in those, because we're seeing that alternative pathways are no longer even really alternative when a really high percentage of the American population is actually getting these types of credentials now.
So just to remind us, we started that tracking in 2016 with the Strata Gallup work, and that is ongoing into the future. And so this next wave of Strata Gallup education consumer survey data has an increased focus on non-degree credentials and motivations for upskilling and reskilling. And that data is right now, went out last week. And so we'll have a survey of over 10,000 Americans by the end of June. We'll have data back, as well as this week-to-week pulse and tracking. And we can certainly, we'll look at the questions to add in the meantime to this tracking. Thank you.
One question we have around the 5,000, how would you spend $5,000? So the question is whether that's just a proxy number, is that estimates around cost of education? Can you speak to that finding and maybe the question itself?
Andrew, I like your smile, and you're the one who talked to us about how to create a forced choice or scarce resource question. And why don't you just explain behind that?
Yeah, I think it creates a different answer when you impose scarcity on people. If you said you had scarce resources, where would you go to spend them in a consumer choice kind of framework? So that was the thinking behind putting a specific dollar value, but it wasn't, we wanted it to be bigger than a bread box, but it isn't necessarily tied to any particular price level in the market.
Another question, will you be able to differentiate between those that might be currently enrolled in higher ed versus those that are maybe working full-time?
Nicole?
Yeah, short answer, yes. We have their employment status and whether they're a student. So that's going to be another area that we dig into deeper as we get more and more data, so that we have a robust sample size and we can tell you about students and students of different demographic groups.
We have a number of folks who are familiar with the larger general survey that Strata has been fielding for the last 4 years are asking where might there be some points of comparison between this weekly shorter survey, and what are the things you'll be looking to compare?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say there are a few questions that we carried over from the larger survey. We didn't report out on those today. I think we are continuing to track people's perceptions around their need for education and where they would go in a slightly different way than the questions that you all saw today. Right now, we were focused mostly on the questions that seem most relevant in people's mind in terms of job loss and things like that, but there are some points of continuity, and we'll be reporting out on those so you can kind of see the year-to-year comparison on some of those points.
Our colleague, Carol D'Amico, who's really been a mentor to me and had the vision at the outset of this work of its value. She constantly reminds me, I don't have to tell everybody everything I know, and I don't have to put it all on one chart. So, but really, we think it's early to do those comparisons. We want to aggregate a little more data so we can do the race, ethnicity, and some of those breakouts and come back as this settles down and have a larger sample size. But we're absolutely tracking those couple things. And then this pre-post Gallup work also within a couple of months will give us great comparisons there.
Great. Another question, perhaps a suggestion for future tracking, is whether you can track people's opinions of the quality of different types of education or institutional sectors, two-year public versus for-profit versus apprenticeships. And could we even look at kind of the broader question around the quality of online education?
Thank you. Absolutely. The data in our broader, we have 350,000 people who've answered those questions about their experience with education over the past 4 years. And we're continuing that quality and value and relevance, all those ingredients of what makes for a valuable education from the education consumer perspective. And so that'll be coming back full circle. We do know that historically there's a variety of experiences across online providers. The variation within the methodology is greater than the variation across different pathways. And so we will be looking at that as people look to online and trying to inform all of us about key ingredients to success and support across those platforms. And certainly, I think, part of the model of this webinar series is that we'll have experts. Today, Nicole and Andrew and I have shared the data, but as we get into these topical discussions, we'll be pulling in partners and leaders from other walks of life and expertise to join us in these and discuss on some of these issues as well.
We're also seeing a lot of interest in both the number of folks who think they will need new additional education, but also those who do not believe that. What do we know about that question? Are there any additional findings we can share at this point?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting one. Dave, do you want me to go ahead, or do you want to speak to this?
All yours.
Okay, so we have a few different insights into that. The percentage, mostly what we're seeing is this is steady across week to week in terms of the percentage of people who feel that they would need additional education if they lost their job just to maintain their status quo, their current level of income. But then we've also looked at this compared to our 2019 data from Gallup, and it's also remarkably steady. So that's kind of interesting that the total perceived need hasn't necessarily changed. Some of what has changed have been people's preferences for how that education is delivered.
And again, I think as the reality settles in of what this feels like and what jobs are available and are not available, and our labor market analytics friends and family, EMSI, is certainly at the forefront of that, and we're working with them how we can integrate this data about consumer perceptions of I want a job in this industry and it'll be there and I don't need skills, or I do, and where the job postings actually are, and starting to look at those. So it's an area we need to pay attention to, and we certainly will be.
Great. Another question we have is, have you been able to track, so for those that do feel that they need additional education or training, have you asked them about how they will pay for it? Are there concerns around how they may pay for that?
We've not asked that at this point in this survey. 2 weeks in, and as things settle and as state policies and stimulus and federal and kind of the realities of how they might choose to pay for it and enter into those experiences, I think that may be the moment to start asking about preferences and awareness. But we're monitoring that and welcome the nudges and the inputs on questions that would be the right way to ask it, and even timing of when you think it would be helpful to you to start understanding that.
Another question here, do you have a sense of how well people understand what kind of education leads to what sort of employment or career pathways?
Yeah, I think there's a few things in there. I think sometimes this is an area where people's prior experience seems to really have a role, because people who have been to college before, we're seeing they feel much more confident that they know how to navigate that system, whereas people who don't have any kind of college experience are a lot less confident that they know where to go and what types of education they would need in order to get the skills they need. That's something we'll be digging into again.
Yeah, we're adding questions and rotating, and things are in and out. We put in a new question that's in the field today that we'll look at for next week about awareness of the skills they would need to secure the job they're seeking in the industry that they're seeking that. And so we're trying to get closer to, one question is a general abstract belief, and another is clarity and confidence about the path and the quality and the provider. And that's been a part of our DNA on the larger Strata Gallup education consumer work over the last 4 years. And we don't have the robustness or the depth on data at this point, but we're working toward it.
Another question, which I think the broader survey touches on, is they're wondering, where are people getting their information? Are people turning to news sources? What other sources of information? I believe we may have some of that insight, Dave.
Yeah, we have in this, we have trusted sources of information, and about broadly COVID-19 and the pandemic. We're not tracking sources of information about education in this specific study. We've looked at it in a couple places on specific things, but not in this new world and not early on. It's a good point that we'll need to come back to.
Of the 54% who prefer online learning, for those that choose additional education, do you have any insight into how a person's current education level impacts their choice for online versus in person?
Nicole, I think this is in the data we haven't reported, kind of looking pre-post, where we've got more of that look at preferences and by education level. And again, I think we're orienting you to the data. But Nicole, I don't know if there's a quick comment you'd have from a...
Yeah, I would say that what we've seen initially anyway is that the preference for the level of provider depends on previous education. So people who already have a bachelor's degree are looking not at the community college. It's pretty straightforward. People who don't have any kind of degree would look towards that online community college. But it hasn't been anything that stands out in terms of a pattern of who does and doesn't prefer online. That's kind of everyone's preference right now, and that may just be the reality of how things are being delivered, but we haven't seen, it's something we'll be looking into more. We haven't seen right away any kind of pattern that sticks out in terms of education level and preference for online or not.
The biggest drop really has been expectations. This is foreshadowing, but expectations that employer provided education would be available compared to a year ago. And in this climate, maybe that's not a surprise, but so if people aren't expecting to find that through their employers, then they're pushing back, and everything else is bubbling up a little higher than it was previously from our early kind of glance at those trends.
Mm-hmm.
Will you all be able to break this out by political leanings? Will we be able to see whether there's any difference in red versus blue states?
We are capturing the ideology and political affiliations of the individuals. And we know there's in the past been Pew and others who've reported kind of annually about the perceptions of the abstract value of the system and trust in the system. What we have found consistently across our work is that people are more alike than different when it comes to their own personal education. And with tremendously high numbers of individuals who would do it all over again, who would recommend it to someone like them, you know, in the 80% piece. So we'll have that information, and we can use it as it's helpful to leaders in their choices and their needs. But we haven't reported on that or even looked at it yet.
Another question is, you know, what have you learned so far about the some college no degree population, particularly around, you know, whether they are now thinking they might go back and complete a degree, but I think maybe more broadly across the data set. What are you seeing so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think something that we saw in those initial slides on job loss that was interesting about that population is, although this is hitting everyone really hard, in some ways that population was a little bit less impacted by having lost jobs or income or being worried about losing jobs. So it's something, I think a lot of times when you first start researching, sometimes it raises more questions than answers, right? And so that's where we want to look into the industries in which people are employed, and definitely be looking at, you know, where those folks are now and what they're expecting to do with their future education.
With the current data set, do we have any insight into those who are caregivers and are maybe juggling childcare along with their additional daily responsibilities?
We actually, we have questions about the people's, if they have children in the home, and if their schools are open, and if their schools are closed, if their schools are open for in-person versus online, and that includes you know, daycare, pre-K, K through 12, and adult children. So we do have some of that data available to us. We don't have anything profound to tell you about it right now, but again, looking at the burden people are facing. And it's interesting that the worries, the concerns about relationship with children and with spouse and kind of or partners are much less than the other worries. And some of that is actually decreasing a little bit as people have figured out this in the first 3 or 4 weeks of you know, disruption and isolation of those routines.
Another question here, are you asking about student debt at all? And are you seeing any concerns there about folks' abilities to either pay back debt or take on additional education?
We have not pursued that in this national tracking. So we have those numbers in the broader data set, but not at this point.
Great. Well, I think we've gone through most of the questions. This has been great. I'm just looking to make sure I'm not missing anyone's perspective here. One question is, do you have any, again, can you break this down by recent college grads or those that are in college preparing for the workforce? Are you seeing employers cut down on internship programs? And is that maybe prompting younger people to think about returning to college once they graduate?
Andrew, I don't know if you, Andrew has spent a number of years at the Georgetown Center for Education and the Workforce, the Georgetown University Center for Education and the Workforce. You've seen some of these issues in the past through the 2008 recession and commented on that. I don't know if you'd speak to anything that general principles as well as things we may be monitoring going forward.
To answer the question directly, I think the survey instrument is a bit too small to directly survey those populations, relative to the general population survey of 1,000 adults. But yes, I can speak to that. I would say there is this last in, first out phenomenon that you see, especially in recessions, where younger workers and less tenured workers are the first ones that are laid off or fired as employers downsize in anticipation of a recession. And so I don't think there's any reason to anticipate that will be different as well. Of course, there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty. And then I will say generally, Despite the article I read in the New York Times a couple of days ago, this is the third recession that has hit the generation of millennials, and two, there will be major ones. And so there are long-term effects associated with recession, especially as we think about the class of 2020 and other workers who are starting their careers out, that we expect will be especially at risk going forward. And so access, I think, to things like internships and other sort of options that employers provide are of concern, I would think, going forward. But as we've said, it's probably too early to tell.
Perhaps one of our final questions, are you asking folks about the supports that they need for those that have lost their job? Are you asking about supports they need or the supports they might anticipate needing?
Nicole?
Not yet, but I think that is a great avenue as we look at both the supports people would need to continue their education or the supports people need in general to find a new job, and education being one of them, but along a spectrum of different types of support.
Great. Well, I know we've gotten a lot of additional great recommendations for topics to dig into, and I see a lot of suggestions around understanding the employer perspective on all of this, right? And there's been this question of will employers be providing training and the resources to upskill or reskill? So I see that as a common recommendation for the Strata team to dig into. And certainly lots of interest in being able to see the data broken out by industry and other demographics. So I know that's on your radar. So good to see that we're tracking on a lot of those. We'll give everyone back a little bit of time in their day, but before I wrap this up, Dave, anything else you'd like to leave with the group?
Just our appreciation. We know you're interested because you want to solve problems for people and help them. And that's the same motivation we share with you. And so as we have this Center for Consumer Insights, our goal is really to be a place where we can come together and collaborate and share information and convene and work on solutions and problems. Strata is doing that in other ways in our partnerships, and we just want to be a hub for the research that can help the field across our efforts. So thank you for the interest and the time today, for the input that we'll capture and digest, for the good thinking and the prompts of looking around the corner and looking ahead to things we could be doing and paying attention to with our analyses. And Jenna, thank you for hosting today, and for as I expressed earlier, all our colleagues who've been working late hours and late nights to help us package this and get it to you in a timely way. We'll be doing it each Wednesday. Maybe not a webinar every week, but certainly a data release and reports and charts and slides that will be coming to you. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you all and have a great afternoon. I hope you all stay healthy and well.